Hello, I'm James Mayer, and I'm in Porto today with Adrian Bridge, the CEO of the Fladgate Partnership, the Yeatman Hotel, and Taylor Sport. Adrian Bridge, good morning.
James, good morning.
Last summer, Barack Obama was the keynote speaker at the Porto Protocol summit. This was a major initiative that you launched to mitigate climate change. Would you like to talk about it?
Yes, I think the issue of climate change is clearly very important for the whole of the wine industry. In fact, the whole of the agricultural sector is clearly greatly affected by change in climate, and we see that in the Douro Valley. And I think there's actually more that we can do about it, and there's a number of sort of key points, I think, that make the wine industry a specific, or creates a specific position for leadership within the wine industry. So it's important, it affects all of us, and there's no time to waste.
Sure. I believe you're just back from the United States, where you were promoting the Porto Protocol. How did the Americans respond?
Well, obviously everybody's interested in this. There are certain camps that are perhaps in denial of the reality of climate change, but for all of us, we see it day in, day out, whether it's wildfires or excessive snowfalls in the Alps or droughts for multiple years in whether the Atlas Mountains or in South Africa. And I think, no matter where we go, we're seeing the effects, we're having to live with it. And I think the wine industry has a number of points that are extremely important that allow us to share experiences across the world, because broadly speaking, we're growing the same plant, more or less, with the same objective, to produce wine. And we therefore are doing so under a lot of different climatic conditions. We're all learning what we're doing. We as tailors have been fairly active in this area for about 20 years or so, but we're probably not very good at sharing, or haven't been particularly good at sharing with a wider audience everything that we're doing.
Yes. You're now preparing the Climate Change Leadership Conference. The theme for this conference is Solutions for the Wine Industry. What specific contributions can the wine industry make to mitigating climate change?
Well, I think there's 4 key points that make the wine industry important, that people really need to think about, that are in the industry. The first is that the wine industry has a plant, the vine, which is a particularly hardy plant, but it has a very fragile fruit. The fact that it's a hardy plant means it actually can often grow in very remote regions. And I think that what we see is many places of the world, it is the vine and the wine industry that is supporting the socio-economic activity of that region. So it's actually very critical for remote areas. And I think that's also quite critical for a number of aspects of our culture and history. And of course, I would point to the Douro as a good example, because if you took the vine out of the Douro, there's nothing there.
Sure, yeah.
I think the second point that I would focus on is that the wine industry, particularly vineyards, are typically owned within family structures. So that gives 2 things. That gives you a chance to, a memory, if you like, that is passed down between generations. But it also means that the current owners are not just thinking about profit and loss, they're thinking about what they are leaving as a legacy to future generations. And when we're talking about climate change, although the steps that you can take can actually be financially very positive immediately, nonetheless there are other steps you take which have longer term benefits. And so that family structure, I think, is quite important.
Yes, it's interesting you should talk about this notion of multi-generations. Of course, with climate change, we're now in we're in an accelerating process. And of course, today you're preparing the Climate Change Leadership Conference, which is going to take place in Porto. You've lined up a very impressive list of speakers, ranging from climatologists to wine producers. What are some of the issues that you expect them to be bringing to the table?
Well, so I think the point about our industry is that we have the capacity to share solutions. I think too many conferences around the world focus on the problem, and everybody wants to have a conference talking about the problem and throwing out statistics of what the world will or won't do if we have 1.5% change and how much time's left and all these various different reports. And they're very good intergovernmental bodies, of which obviously the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, provides very good data. I think that we have to move beyond talking about the problem and talk about the solutions. And I think within the wine industry, what we're gathering is people from around the world who've got a number of different solutions, a number of different experiences that they can share. Because the issue, when you think about it, is that we will learn faster if we learn from people who've already implemented solutions, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's neither the time nor indeed the necessity to reinvent the wheel. I think what we can do is learn from each other. Now, we're not particularly good at that in any industry. Wine industry is no exception in that point. That you find sometimes the pressure to compete with your neighbor is so intense that you tend to want to guard all of your secrets. But the reality is, climate doesn't respect the boundaries or limits of one vineyard from another. We're all affected by this, and we're all therefore part of the solution. And I think it's important to, think about the wine industry. I would argue that the wine industry is the only branded agricultural industry in the world. And I say that, I think that's a point of real importance, because most people, are consuming 3 times a day agricultural products, assuming they eat 3 meals a day. But broadly speaking, they have absolutely no idea where the raw material came from. And even if they're enjoying a whiskey, a vodka, a beer, or any other alcoholic beverage, again, if they talk to the people who make those, there's very little sense of where the raw material came from, because quite often it is purely a commoditized product, a barley or a hop or whatever. There's clearly going to be specific cases that is not but in the broad, that is the case. Whereas actually when you go and talk to the wine industry, you talk to a winemaker, they can probably give you the GPS of where the raw material comes from. And I think that sense of place is extremely important. I think it's a very huge differentiating factor for the wine industry. I think that it means the wine industry can take a leadership position. And I would also supplement that by saying that because the wine industry actually talks to the end consumer, which obviously in commoditized agricultural businesses they don't, but we do, and we have that ability to transmit that passion, to transmit the story, and to tell people what we're doing. And so rather than always focusing on wonderful stories of our heritage and our authenticity, which are important, we nonetheless should also be talking about what is our carbon footprint? How much water do we use? Because if you talk to a consumer today and say you've got 1 bottle of wine, imagine from a grape variety, Chardonnay, 1 bottle of Chardonnay, another bottle of Chardonnay, both essentially the same to a consumer. They're both jolly good wines and come from nice heritage, might come from different parts of the world. But if one uses, say, 2 litres of water to be made and another uses 5 or 10 litres, the consumer's going to make a choice based on that. So this is a powerful tool that we have because we have that relationship with the end consumer. And therefore, we've got to start to think about that and start to use it. And that's why we need to focus on solutions, focus on sharing, focus on the fact that we are all part of the solution, and focus on the fact that we're all affected by the same climate changes.
Yes. And do you think the consumers themselves are likely to see any changes in the type of wine they find in their bottle as a result of climate change?
Well, I think there's a huge amount of potential. A lot of comments out there about potential changes that will take place between whether it'll be possible to grow certain wines in certain countries, whether they'll have to do more clonal selection, whether they'll have to change the altitude, whether there'll be all sorts of things which are potentially out there. I think it's very difficult to make those predictions. I also think that when people talk about the solution for climate change is plant my vines higher up the hill because it will be cooler, they're really talking about a very narrow point, which can be intellectually debated, but is broadly irrelevant in this, and that is they're talking about global warming, as in the average temperature is higher, so I'll move up the hill. Climate change is not just about average temperatures. Climate change is about disruption on our weather patterns. You know, if I look at 2018, on 25th of May 2018 in the Douro Valley around Pinhal, we had about 12% of our annual rainfall in a single hour.
Yes, I remember.
At the town of Pinhal, which is 40 meters from the River Douro and about 10 meters higher than the River Douro, nonetheless had water that was half a meter deep in the street because it couldn't drain out fast enough to the river, which was right next to it. And it's that sort of disruption which obviously caused in the region massive erosional problems. In fact, in some vineyards, of course, the rain actually fell as hail, as in one of our properties, where it destroyed the entire crop for the year. So, you know, it's not about global warming. That is an issue, of course, but it is around disruption of weather patterns and what you can do. And again, you know, I can draw on other examples that are impactful to wineries, where you see consequence of what your neighbour is doing actually impacting your own vineyard.
Sure, yeah. And how about the consumer themselves? Do you think we're going to find a different type of behaviour?
Yeah, they care. They absolutely care. And I think if you go and talk to consumers, you know, there's lots of discussion about how do we reach, you know, generational X, how do we reach millennials, how do we reach all these people? Well, one of the ways is to talk to them about the things that they are concerned with. And one of the things they're very concerned is with climate change, because after all, if you are 20 or 25, you're going to be living with the problem a whole lot longer than your parents or grandparents are. So, you know, it's a real issue. They care about it, and they are actually prepared broadly to change their approach in order to help combat it. I mean, it's quite interesting if I look at my own children, and they don't own cars. They live in a city. Well, when I remember living in a city in my early 20s, I had a car. They say, I don't need a car. Why do I need a car? I mean, it's you know, I'll use one of these app services, or I use public transport or whatever. I just don't need that. And it's not good for the environment to have one. So they're taking a stand simply by what they're doing, not by what they're saying, but what they're doing. And we've always got to watch what people are doing. And I think that comes back to the wine industry. We can, you know, read all the marketing we want to, but actually what we're really interested in what are people actually doing in their vineyards to help solve the problem. And look at what they're doing, share what they're doing, learn from each other, and then together we can help solve the problem. We can help mitigate the problem. We're not going to solve it alone, but we can certainly all make a contribution to help.
Let's consider another aspect of the picture for a moment. Wine tourism. I find with my own tour company, Great Discoveries, that when I take people to the Douro, they actually have a different kind of connection with the wine, presumably because they're experiencing the terroir. Do you think it's likely that we're going to find different kinds of wine tourism emerge, you know, that are more adapted to the reality of climate change?
Well, I mean, and clearly, if you talk about climate change in its extremes, then there will be impact in tourism, not necessarily wine tourism, but tourism per se, because I think about 90% of the world's constructed hotel base is within about 10 meters of sea level. And that's because people go on holiday to the beach, or it's in major cities which were, you know, normally on rivers for historical transport reasons, which are, of course, vulnerable to change in sea levels. But you're specifically talking about the wine industry, and I think the truth is that people are interested in wine. They want to discover it. They're looking for experiences. They do want to visit the region, so we can say, oh, well, you know, if they're visiting, there's a carbon footprint cost to that visit. That is certainly true, and perhaps that in order to accept that fact, you know, maybe what we need to do is use lighter weight bottles, which have, you know, a bottle is a very heavy carbon producer, because we accept that people are coming to visit us, and there's a carbon footprint that's coming from their visits, and that in the balance, you know, we can help to solve the issue. But tourism is here to stay. Experiences are what a younger generation is looking for. They're not looking for material assets, they're looking for experiences. And I think from a winery's point of view, again, the wine industry is a very strange industry. If you think about it, what people have historically done is they've gone and found a piece of dirt that broadly had nothing, identified that it might be good to plant some vines in, so they plant the vines, and they tend these things, and they nurse them, and they, after a few years of growing the crop, they then have a product that they want to sell. The first thing they do is they take samples, put it in a suitcase, and rush off around the world trying to find a consumer, and then when they found someone interested, build a distribution system in order to serve those customers. And that is an old model. The current model is that there's a visitor knocking on your door saying, I want to come in and I want to learn about this. And there's no point putting a sign up saying, I'm sorry, I'm in the other part of the world talking to people with a PowerPoint presentation, when actually you could show really self-selected interested people, because they're knocking on your door, what you really do, and create that emotional attachment and emotional connection with them, which, if done properly, can last a lifetime.
As the industry adapts to climate change, I'd really love to know, what personal advice would you like to give to a young person beginning to appreciate and get to know wines?
Well, look, I think the beauty of wine is that there's almost an infinite variety of wines, because we've got a lot of different grape varieties, we have a lot of different soils, we have a lot of different climates, we have a lot of different approaches in how it's made, and there's a wine for everyone, and B, you can never really stop on your journey of exploration, and that's what makes it really quite fun. And I think that I would certainly say to anybody who's, no matter where you are in your wine journey, keep on exploring, because there's just so much out there.
What kind of outcomes would you like to be celebrating after the conference?
Well, the conference,
possibly with a glass of Taylor's Port.
Well, I'd love to do it with a glass of Taylor's Port, or indeed, any other fine glass of port. But I think the really key thing is that we start to help people make a difference. I think it's, I think the problem sometimes is that people feel that A, there's a magic bullet, and that there's going to be a new technology that will solve the whole thing, or B, government's going to fix this. And the reality, all of us have a contribution to make. And I think if you're running a business, then you have to look at the economics of this. And quite often, doing the right thing for the climate also actually saves money and improves your profitability. This isn't always a cost. There is a strong benefit to it. And obviously, the best way to do that is to not spend lots of time and money experimenting, but actually just learn from people who've done it before, and then be able to implement and hit the target first time. And so if from running the Climate Change Leadership Solutions for the Wine Industry event here in Porto in the 5th to the 7th of March of 2019, we are able to engage more people to go back to their wineries, implement change, and start to make a difference, that will be success. These things are never done in a single day, and that's why we have this thing called the Porto Protocol. The Porto Protocol is an open platform. You, James, have with your company have signed up to join the Porto Protocol, because the Porto Protocol is both a movement as well as an ability to share solutions. And that platform is there. So what we're asking people to do is really two things. They're really fairly simple things. The first is we're asking them to do more tomorrow than they're doing today. And the reason it's deliberately vague is because if we set a target and said, right, we need a 10% reduction in your carbon footprint. Well, if you didn't know your carbon footprint, how can you sign up to that? Very tricky. But I think most people understand that doing more is possible. And if you're just starting your journey, there are some obvious, easy things to do. If you're already some way down your journey, as we at Taylor's Port are, then what else can you do? And I think that brings us to the second part of the Porto Protocol, is that we're asking people to share their experiences. And so, I'll be looking at that website for inspiration for what next we can do, because I'm seeing what other companies elsewhere in the world have done, and I can talk to them or see from the website exactly the case study of what they've done and what works, and then try and implement that in our own business.
Indeed. Well, we're looking forward to some very stimulating exploration of these important issues at the Climate Change Leadership Conference in Porto from the 5th to the 7th of March. Adrian Ridge, thank you very much.
James, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.